So Startups Inside Out, we've got Jing here today, co-founder of Patchwork. Can you tell us what Patchwork does?
Yeah, of course. So Patchwork is an end-to-end workforce management solution for healthcare organizations, and we predominantly work with NHS trusts in the UK. So when we talk about workforce management, what we mean by that is things like scheduling and rostering of clinicians, because these are regulated workers that you need certain skills, certain coverage of seniority in various different wards and clinical settings. And we also deal with the temporary staffing side as well. So any kind of vacant shifts, we have a marketplace platform that allows clinicians to book and browse shifts on demand. So very much like an Uber for doctors.
And you've been here for almost 10 years, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We started back in 2015, 2016. Back when, I don't know if any of the audience recalls, there was a big focus around efficiency in the NHS. Well,
Isn't it always it?
yeah. It's quite cyclical.
Okay, yeah.
But at the time, there was a real staffing crisis.
Mm.
The BBC was pushing the figure that NHS trusts were spending 3.6 billion on agency staff. And both myself and my co-founder Anas were working as locum doctors. So locum doctors are basically 0-hour doctors that pick up shifts here and there. And that's when we spotted an opportunity, because we saw that the NHS was overspending on agency staff. We knew that if hospitals better utilize their internal staff, then they'd get more efficiency with their staffing costs. And as two doctors ourselves that were living and breathing the problem, we recognized that if we could just make the experience to the clinicians better, then actually you'd get more internal bookings, less agency staff, and the NHS trust saved money. So everyone's happy.
And obviously, to go for 9 years means that you've been doing pretty well. Where are you today?
Yeah. I mean, with any kind of business that services predominantly public sector enterprises, healthcare, it's been it's been a long slog. But yeah, the business is doing fantastically well. So when we started off, we were a marketplace platform for locum doctors, so that Uber for doctors, as I described. We saw a lot of traction there and started organically spreading across the NHS. We then became more multi-product. So we went into, we tried to become the end-to-end solution for workforce management. And to date, we work with 58% of all NHS trusts. We have over 100,000 clinicians on our system. So yeah, fairly scaled in UK healthcare, it must be said.
And you went down the venture route as well, right? What was behind that decision?
I don't think there was too much considered thinking, if I'm honest. When Anas and I started out, we were just junior doctors at the time, and not even particularly senior. We knew we wanted to work in technology and innovation, but we didn't really have a network. A lot of the founders that I see today, if they're from like a McKinsey or a Google, they've already got things all set up. As an NHS doctor, Anas and I, we didn't have those same kind of networks. We didn't know any VCs or even like any technologists, or financiers. So when we started off, we had this vague idea that we should probably raise money to get this idea going. And yeah, like the way the story went was that so Anas was working as what they call a Darcy Fellow. So he was like a management consulting fellow in Chelsea and Westminster. And he'd been given the responsibility to redesign the temporary staffing service. And that was where a lot of the inspiration for the initial product came about. We pitched it to the hospital thinking that they could fund us, which is, very off-piste to what an NHS trust would typically do. But they helpfully directed us to their board of directors who knew some high net worth individuals. And that's essentially how we got started. A contact of one of the board directors took a chance on us, gave us our first seed check. And that's how we got started. So we took that money, then we raised subsequent rounds, because what we were trying to do was quite capital intensive to build this workforce platform. So I guess to go back to your question, we weren't too considered in terms of funding routes, hadn't really thought about it other than we wanted to do this thing. We wanted to solve this problem. And it felt like, of course, we needed to raise money. So that was the kind of journey that we went on.
And is it about 30 million or so you've raised?
Well, about 50 million. Yeah. I mean, we are now private equity backed.
Yeah.
So we've been really fortunate actually in that in the early years, it was really tough fundraising because there were a lot of competitors. There was, because the problem was so big, the 3.6 billion in NHS, and every single clinician entrepreneur had this idea for an Uber for doctors. There was like a Cambrian explosion of locum apps, as they called them at the time. And on top of that, when we were raising our seed, a competitor had just announced their Series A in TechCrunch, making the declaration that they were going after the same problem space, the same market as us, which you can imagine that was like pouring cold water on all investors. So it was really tough in the early years, but we slowly grafted and got traction. And then we got our Series A investor, which was Pretora, which is the Northern Fund, and they've now become PXN. And that was when I think our fortune started turning, when we started professionalizing as a venture-backed business. And when our Series B investor came in, which was Perwin, they brought more than just the capital. They also brought a lot of M&A expertise. And part of the reason why we fundraise so much is that we've also taken on capital to acquire businesses. And that's been an incredible experience. So at the end of 2024, we acquired a business called L2P, which stands for License to Practice. And they provide products in job planning, appraisal, revalidation. I mean, all part of that kind of value chain for workforce management for medics. And that's been super synergistic. And and that's why we've raised so much.
So you said like how lots of people had the same idea as you, right?
Yes.
And then obviously, as a doctor, there's lots of doctors might have the same idea. What do you think you did that made you win against some of these other competitors and other people who tried it and didn't quite work out?
Well, my genius, obviously. No, it was, I think firstly, we were lucky. And I think that really needs to be recognized because I think the timing was good. Because there were a couple of startups that came like maybe a year or two beforehand, and they were too early. The NHS was simply not ready for it. But we emerged around the time, so I mentioned 2015, 2016, where the problem of agency staffing had really precipitated. And the head of NHS England at the time, Simon Stevens, had just released the 5-year forward view, this big policy piece, basically stating that the NHS needs to adopt innovation in order to find the 20 billion in annualized efficiency savings. So we landed at a point where all the NHS trusts were thinking about innovation, thinking about startups, thinking about these clinical innovators. So that was key because those that came before probably struggled to fundraise, were really not showing the track record. Those that came afterwards, they were a bit too late because there were so many that emerged. And to be honest, when we emerged at the time, we discovered a bunch of startups that had just started up, probably in the same year window as us. So that was key. So firstly, it was the timing. And I think we got lucky with the timing. The second thing as well is, credit to my co-founder and CEO, Anas. He had done a lot of work with Chelsea and Westminster on the problem space that we were addressing. I think a lot of clinical entrepreneurs very much see it from the perspective of the doctor. So they're thinking about their own pain points, which of course are really valid. But if you can't understand how the system works, how the engine room runs and how the back office, or how it all plugs in together, then you're always going to be at a disadvantage. And, the advantage that we had with Anas being a Darcy Fellow is that he really understood how things worked from an operational and from a managerial level. So that gave us a huge rounded view of how to solve the problem. And of course, then the relationships needed because Chelsea and Westminster ended up being our first client. So that was really how we got started. We got lucky with the timing. We found an ideal partner. And I think between Anas and myself, we had a rounded and holistic understanding of the problem that we were trying to solve. And I think that was just a great foundation to begin with.
But I feel like you've said great work, what great work Anas did as well there.
Yes.
But it's also like, what side did you focus on? Where was your strength throughout this? Like, where did you really focus on in the early days? Because I feel like you're giving all the credit to him, but you get
I was very much Anas's lackey. Well, in the early stages, you wear lots of different hats. I think what is worth pointing out that both Anas and I were doctors. We didn't have a technical co-founder. So you can imagine that really shaped some of the early kind of philosophy and the early experience, because you make these subconscious trade-offs, right? That you don't think about at the time because you're too naive to think about. But because we didn't have a technical co-founder, it meant that building the product was a bit more challenging and certainly more costly than if you had a technical co-founder, which I'm sure many guests will have mentioned. But the advantage that we did have was that we both came from clinical backgrounds and we really lived the problem, but also as well, like in our previous lives, we'd done a lot of roles in NHS management and innovation. So what we ended up then prioritizing was customer success. We really cared about delivery and making sure that the product really delivered the outcomes for the NHS organizations that we were serving. So for myself, I was the chief operating officer for the majority of my time at Patchwork. And that meant being responsible for the implementation, the account management, the support, and subsequently the integrations. So it was very much about making the solution really work and not parachuting in a SaaS tool and leaving them to their own devices, which is a very valid approach for many kind of SMEs, many businesses. But in the NHS, that just simply did not fly. And in both of us as well, through our backgrounds, we were doing the selling. So we kind of divided and conquered there in the early years. But, the way I saw it was that Anas focused very much around the company. He took the lead on fundraising and, he did a lot of the selling. I was also selling as well, but through delivery, and I had the responsibility of making sure the projects were a success.
So it's quite a big difference being a doctor there as well, right? What was the stuff that you did at Patchwork that you really enjoyed that maybe you didn't expect?
Well, if we compare against, think because you mentioned about, being a doctor. I think just to touch a little bit on that, I loved clinical practice. I was on track to become an academic endocrinologist, which would have made my parents very happy. But I was always the kind of person who was like a bit contrarian. I like to challenge the status quo. I like to ask the questions of like, why are we doing things this way? And I'll get really frustrated. And I wanted to make that impact and make that change. But when you're a doctor, you go through lengthy training, you get really taught about what it means to manage risk. And it's a conveyor belt. So it was a real gear change, going from this kind of conveyor belt approach. If I just stayed here, jumped through all the hoops, got my hours in, then I would become that consultant that my parents dreamed I would be. But then being an entrepreneur, it was daunting to have such a change in mentality, but also exhilarating as well, because I wanted to be the master of my own destiny, right? And I wanted to make impact at scale. So you had to take risk in doing that. And I guess going back to the second part of that, which was what I enjoyed the most, I think I really enjoyed the agency. I enjoyed that every minute that I spent on Patchwork was making a difference. And I could see that direct translation from idea to execution to outcome. And it was remarkable the things that we built, the ideas that we had, and how that made a profound difference to the clients that we served. And of course, when you're a doctor, you make a big impact on patients. And I'm no longer clinically practicing, and I do miss that aspect of it. But it has to be said, when you build a technology, you can really deliver impact at scale, and we serve 100,000 clinicians. So that was the thing that I found most rewarding.
You mentioned your parents here as well. And so move on to the stats behind this too, right? Where of the major sectors in the UK in terms of tech, health tech is where Asian founders are contributing the most or raising the most money. And there's different reasons it could be for, but it's probably partly because so many Asian parents are encouraging their kids to become doctors, right?
Yeah.
So when you went from becoming like a full-time doctor to then going into this other stuff, was that a hard transition for you? Or was it quite a easy pull?
In the context of my parents, I think that they actually were supportive, because to some extent I had, ticked all the boxes, for the community, right? I'd gone to a good university, I'd graduated and become a doctor, so, they had the bragging rights. And then what I did after that, as I mentioned, I come from a family of academics, so they really value that part of, those professions. And their dream was for me to become both a consultant in a hospital, but also a professor in a university. When I talked to them about entrepreneurial ideas, they didn't really understand tech. So I was often butting heads, and that's my contrarian nature coming out. But they were ultimately supportive because, I mean, to some extent, they thought the risk wasn't too big because I could always just go back into into clinical practice. There's always a shortage for doctors, um, but they always wanted me to hedge my bets. They wanted me to, do clinical practice alongside running the startup. And as we all know, when you are really in the weeds of a startup, it's all consuming. It's 996. It is everything you live, eat, and breathe. So that was just not possible. And they were very apprehensive about that. But they agreed. And they didn't really understand anything that I did. But when they started seeing things like the fundraising rounds, when they started seeing the news, when they started seeing the profile of the business go up, they started thinking, maybe maybe he's onto something. I can't say that they were, believers in the idea because they didn't really understand that. So it was completely alien to them. But credit to them, they were very supportive and they were an incredible safety net.
Hello, hello. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I'm Amardeep Parmar, co-founder of BayHQ and the host of this show. For those of you who don't know, BayHQ is the community for high growth Asian heritage founders and investors in the UK. Over 7,500 people have attended our events, 200 people have been for our impact programs, and obviously there's been over 250 episodes of this podcast. If you want to join us and take part in the programs and come to the events, go to bayhq.com/join. We also just released our first ever book called Startups for Outsiders, which you can get on Amazon now, and the link is in the bio. Hope to see you soon at our event. Hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Even say among other doctors, was there that idea of, I always wondered this, like amongst doctors, as you said, because you're scaling and impacting so many other people, right? And you're making more of a difference in that way because you're supporting so many people. But when you're kind of making that transition at the beginning, do other doctors look at that as like they're supporting you, they're trying to encourage you? Or is it like, oh, but like, why don't you just do more shifts or just help people in that way? How's that understanding amongst the medical community at the beginning?
Yeah, it's a really good question because 10 years ago, when Anas and I started the business, it wasn't very common for doctors to leave and start businesses. The healthcare system was also too rigid for that as well. It's changed a lot in the past decade because of the recognition towards medical innovation, but back then it was very alien. I would say that I did get a lot of question marks. People struggle to understand why I wouldn't carry on and at least become a consultant before, various different business ventures. They didn't fully understand why I would leave at such an early stage in my career. Now, fast forward a decade, and we've had the junior doctor strikes. We've had all manner of different kind of changes and erosions of some of the benefits that doctors see. And practicing now in the NHS is quite different to how it was a few decades ago. What I did was quite unusual at the time, but is now very in vogue today. And it's so funny, because I get a lot of clinicians asking me for advice about how you balance a portfolio career, how you start a business. And again, the healthcare system is also so much more accommodating of flexible working patterns to enable clinicians to do these side hustles, alternative careers. And to be honest, that was also the motivation for me starting my own podcast called Out of Program, because I thought, how do I deliver this message at scale? Again, thinking with my entrepreneurial hat on. So yeah, it's completely changed, and in a relatively short space of time.
Have you found that experience as well of your podcast and talking to people who are also trying to do different things outside of their general day-to-day doctor work?
I think what you recognize from interviewing lots of people is that there are patterns, there are methodologies. People may have different ideas, different careers, different specialties, but they're all following the same patterns in terms of how they get started. And I think, when I started the podcast, I realized you can extract out those patterns and then start pattern recognizing how people go. And I'm sure that's the same for yourself as well, interviewing so many successful people. They follow, the varying but probably predictable tracks and probably fall into certain archetypes as well.
And when you're talking to all these clinicians who potentially want to become founders someday, what do you find that you're telling them most often? Is there a certain advice that you seem to like repeat yourself over and over about? And then you can do that at scale today because I hear this and they don't need to ask you that.
Yeah, I think the main one for me is to have a bias towards action and take risks. As I mentioned, when you're a doctor or a clinician in general, you go through lengthy training to mitigate risk. You follow protocols. Everything that you do is to protect yourself legally, whilst, doing the best for the patients and following best practice, evidence-based protocols. When you take that statement and abstract it and think about what it's like, running a business, there are playbooks, but like there's no protocols that are evidence-based in terms of what you should do. And you have to take calculated risks in order to succeed. So part of it is unlearning that. And the other part of it is just get started. A lot of the clinicians are type A personalities. They're very academic. They want to do a course. They want to go through certain hoops and get these certain titles before they start. And my advice is always just get started, because you don't want to be learning that at 40. You want to be learning this at 25. And, a classic example is AI, right? I get a lot of people ask me about how they get more involved in AI. Should they do an AI course at this prestigious university? And I'm like, just download Claude Code. Just have a play around with it. Just try the tools and figure it out. And that's how you'll get the practical knowledge, because the field is moving so quickly. So that's the kind of encouragement that I try and give the clinicians today.
And obviously as CEO as well, you must have quite a big team underneath you.
Yes.
How big is the Patchwork team now?
Oh gosh, the Patchwork team is over 100 people. I mentioned before that we acquired a business, L2P. So the combination of those teams has made us, very, very large. When I was the COO, I think in my heyday, at peak, I was probably managing a structure of 40 to 50 people. So, if you think about teams, implementation, account management, support, integrations, it was a lot. It was a lot. And our clients are very needy, and understandably so, because they deal with patients. There are fires burning in hospitals all the time, as I'm sure you can see from, if you ever, look at BBC News. So they need a lot of support. And so we had a huge structure to be able to provide that wraparound service. Because as I mentioned before, you can't just parachute in the technology. Ultimately, the NHS trusts are buying outcomes. And to ensure the outcome, you have the technology, but also the service to wrap around it. So when I was COO, it was there was a lot going on.
And obviously now as well, with 10 years in and your different roles changing, but you're obviously involved in the hiring and trying to build that team out. What was it that you were looking for? How are you picking out these people that obviously so now you can be in your new role because you've got other people who come in and taking over some of the work you had to do before, right?
Yeah. I think that and this is probably the same for most entrepreneurs. In the early years, you may not have the experience when it comes to hiring. Most people are pretty early on in their careers. They're not professional managers, so they don't have that muscle, as it were. But we ended up hiring a lot of people that we'd worked with or been to university with. And that, I think, is a really good method in the early years, because these are people that you trust, understand how they work, and are presumably smart because they come from, your circles. So that was brilliant. So a lot of those kind of early hires were just referrals and people from our network. We also didn't have a particularly structured methodology in the early years of hiring, so it can be a bit hit and miss. But once you've got that core of people that you really trust and have that working dynamic, you can paper over the rest of the stuff because you've got the trusted individuals, holding the key accountability. And as we grew and evolved, you also go through different phases of what you need. You start off with, brilliant generalists, then you need to specialize somewhat. Every year we were learning and adapting in terms of what we needed and what we hired, and we were getting wiser, every month that passed. But I think I remember listening to a podcast actually of Ali Parsa, who founded Babylon, and he said once that even with the best methodologies, if you can be right on hiring 55% of the time, then on aggregate, you will do all right. But I think also what I took from that is it can sometimes be the luck of the draw. I don't think anyone out there is smashing it with every single hire. And if you are, then you should be paid millions. So it's recognizing that even with the best approaches, it can still be hit and miss. And sometimes that's just because of the environment, because of the domain, and nothing to do with the individual.
Yeah, I think it's always one of those things of where I think when you start your company, a lot of people underestimate that side. Everyone's focusing, how do I fundraise? How do I do this?
Yeah.
It's like, you can fundraise all the money you want, but if you can't get the right team in, then you're not going to be able to use it effectively, right?
Yeah. And I would add to that, actually, it's a lot of people will give the generic advice of just hire the best people. It's all about the people.
Mhm.
And it's like, and I remember thinking about that being like, well, I don't know how actionable that is when I'm like a seed stage business, in health tech with no brand, and I'm hiring the best people. Like that's such a vague, nebulous term. But I think what I've come to take from that is it's almost like a philosophy. It's almost like a mantra, right? And I think when it comes to hiring, there's got to be a recognition of your realities. So you first need to understand what stage you're in, and then really figure out in first principles like what you need. So instead of chasing like someone from a shiny brand, you're really looking at the skills and thinking about what skill type and roles do you need in the organization today? And maybe with a bit of forward planning to think, where is that role going to go and how is the business going to evolve in the subsequent years? But I think if you just take those two kind of principles in mind, then I think it'll put you in very good stead, because I think most entrepreneurs will make the mistake of hiring big names that just don't land culturally, and also really not knowing what like the roles to hire for, because you don't appreciate what stage you're in. Like, are you pre-product market fit? Are you post-product market fit? Like, will adding more salespeople actually like scale the revenue because of where you are? Like, all these questions need to be asked before then going out to hire.
What would you say the culture's like in Patchwork? Like, how have you kind of cultivated that as well?
Consistently, what we hear from the team is that it's a great bunch of people. I mean, of course, I'm not biased in saying that, but I think we attract a lot of mission-driven people because of what we do, because we're ultimately trying to make the NHS more sustainable and also improve the clinician experience when it comes to, how they manage their day-to-day work. So I think the people who join Patchwork are driven by that. And we have a lot of ex-NHS people, whether they're clinicians or workforce system people, who buy into what we're doing. And I think that creates a really nice kind of vibe and a really supportive environment where you don't need to apply those kind of pressures as much, because everyone, wants to do a good job. They feel a huge accountability to our clients.
And you're the CGO now, right?
Yes.
So with that transition and like your work you're doing today, what's kind of led you down this path and what do you do today?
So I think it's a natural kind of scaling journey. I mean, it's a surprise I survived as the COO over this, to be honest. Um, and look, when you start off as a founder COO, I mean, it's not really a chief operations role. You're basically just doing everything, including mopping the floor, making the tea, and also like, managing the high stakes client meetings. I think, over the years, we have needed to professionalize, because now we're, when you're serving 58% of the NHS, that's, over 100 NHS trusts. It's quite a lot. And yeah, like we made the decision at the end of, no, maybe at the end of 2023. It was about a yearish ago. I'm losing track. But essentially, it was the recognition that we have an opportunity to bring in someone who can scale these departments, because they're stable, we're in a good place, we've got more of a rinse and repeat, someone who can work on the processes and build a repeatable machine. Whereas someone like myself, as a founder, I'm more of a problem solver, as it were. And there was also a recognition that there are some things that only founders can do. And so the idea was that we can bring in someone who can take over my chief COO responsibilities, where I could focus more on supporting the business as a founder, as an individual contributor on all things growth. And it's been brilliant because, we managed to bring in someone who is an excellent operator and just build up that talent density. So at some point you need to give away your Legos. And, I've kept them for a very long time. So it's been, it's been interesting, because at the same time, there is an impact on your own identity.
Mhm.
I've been a founder, I've been a COO, I've done things in my own foundery COO way, kind of way. So, to shift those responsibility onto someone else, it's almost like, seeing off your kid for like university, they're going to be around, but they're no longer being influenced by you. And I think that's mature, and I think that's right. That's the right thing to do.
I think it's one of those things that a lot of people don't see is, let's say, like the Mark Zuckerbergs and people like that of the world. That's the anomaly of somebody who started the business and then still there as it's grown and scaled over time. And I think a lot of early stage founders don't really think about that transition of which part do they enjoy the most and where their skills most valuable to, because
Yeah.
obviously being a CEO of a company of 5 people versus one with 100 is a very different role.
Yes.
And there's kind of two elements. One's, is it the same skill set, but also, is it what you want to do and enjoy? And if it's not, then doing a different role where you can add more value makes more sense, right?
Absolutely.
But it's a hard thing from an identity perspective. It's easy for me to say that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, there's so much wrapped into ego and and insecurity that comes with it, because it's a really tough topic to broach with anyone who's a founder, right?
Mhm.
Because you're basically saying, because you almost imply that they're not good enough at the role. Like, why would you need to bring in someone else? Like, isn't everything running fine? But I think it requires a lot of reflection. And yes, that's separation, because you have your own individual goals and kind of career progression, but you also, as a founder, have a fiduciary duty and an ownership towards a business as a whole. So the utilitarian viewpoint is, if someone can come in and do better than I could ever do, I should absolutely be entertaining it. And there's, of course, plenty of things that, only I can do as the founder, because, we've survived this long and we've done, brilliantly. So, I'm never going to become redundant. But like I said, this is all very easy to say in hindsight. I probably went through an emotional roller coaster, as that was all happening. But, I've got no regrets to that change. And I think it was absolutely the right move for the business. It's all part of normal business evolution, I think.
And as well, so you started this with Anas nearly 10 years ago, right? And for that co-founder relationship to last so long, what do you think has kept that relationship so strong and being able to work with each other and do by the same company? Because you sometimes see, like, you have the people who start and then one of the co-founder drops off after a year or two, right?
Yeah, I think, it is often remarked that we've lasted a very long time together. And like, it's
More than most marriages.
yeah, well, I was just about to say it's it's more commitment than a marriage sometimes, because there's, all these legal bindings and, finances involved. And like any marriage, there is, of course, great, highs, but also, bickering challenges, as you would imagine. Like, no one should sugarcoat that, because that is the reality. And as co-founders, you have that familiarity where you can like lower your professional guard and, have the real talk, as it were. And no one should shy away from that. Like, that is just natural as part of any kind of co-founding partnership. Anas and I, when we started out, we were friends. We'd met each other in Imperial College London, in while we were studying medicine, and we actually did a couple of student projects together. So we we were we not only had the friendship, but we also had somewhat of a working relationship. And I think that what was great was that we were friends, but we weren't like super best friends,
Mhm.
at university. And it's through going on this journey together that our friendship has deepened, which, I guess I've got some confirmation bias on this, but I think that's a really nice way to do things, because I think often people, different people have various different takes on like, should you found business with your best friends? Should you found your business with your partners? I think the way we did it was very nice, because it was very additive.
Yeah.
And it enriched our relationship. So that was very sustaining in the early years. And then funnily enough, during the pandemic, we we ended up we well, even before that, we ended up living just round the corner from each other in Camberwell, which I don't know if that's healthy boundaries, but we So it was great. Like, so we were able to hang out a lot socially. And then when COVID hit, we were part of the same bubble. So every weekend we would play board games together, which was really nice. So when we started off, we had a very enriching relationship that grew through our shared interests and our commitment to the business. And we've always maintained a friendship as well. And I think the way I see things as well is I definitely separate the professional Anas from the friend Anas. And I think that's the only way to stay sane, because the moment you start mixing those things, and of course, it can get pretty toxic. But I think that's the way that we've endured.
So you also have your own podcast now as well, right?
Yes.
And what we're doing now is we're going to get a little TV screen up here in the future, and people can come back on again 200 episodes later. So 2 years later. And then what we're going to do is play back this moment right now. And it's in 2 years' time when you come back on, what would you love to say you've been able to do in those 2 years?
Oh, gosh. So from a Patchwork perspective, we remain very focused on the NHS. And what I would love to achieve is the thing Anas and I set out to do right from the beginning, which was make our working lives so much better as doctors. We didn't really touch too much on it, but I remember every day being frustrated by the IT systems that I had to deal with, by the rostering system that never really worked. Everything was done by pen and paper. It was awful. You couldn't get your holiday booked in time. Some people talk about not even getting their weddings off. So all of that I would love to solve. And I think it would be so gratifying if Patchwork was adopted by every single NHS trust, that we had the network effects where a doctor who works in one trust in Liverpool can then travel all the way to a trust in Kent and work and have that brilliant experience where they can manage all their work. I think that from an impact of what we do with Patchwork would be fantastic. And that would be really kind of fulfilling the mission. I guess with the podcast, I would love it to be big. I'd love to be, a Harry Stebbings. I mean, obviously it's fairly niche, but if I can be able to help other clinicians on their own journeys to alternative careers, and it doesn't need to be, starting businesses, and I would love to actually help the NHS retain its brightest minds whilst giving them the career satisfaction through a portfolio career, then I think that would be an amazing job. So what that looks like in 2 years, I think having run Patchwork for close to 10 years, I would never want to be prescriptive, because things can move in very different ways. But I think hopefully I've highlighted what I want the North Stars to be in terms of what I want to achieve.
Awesome. So thanks so much for coming on. Quick fire question time.
Please.
Who are 3 Asians in Britain you think are doing incredible work, and do you want to shout them out?
Yeah. So I prepared for this. So the first one is Dr. Ash Patel, who he was an anaesthetist who then became the head of technology at Babylon before then going into venture capital. So he was at Mercier and Optum before finally landing as the managing director of Houlihan Lokey. So, his career is super inspiring because, he's had such a rich portfolio, and also he's gone deep into finance, and he's probably one of the smartest people I know. An incredible sounding board. Unfortunately, never an investor in Patchwork, unfortunately, despite all his previous VC roles. But yeah, I really trust his judgment, and we've kept tabs over the years as we both progressed throughout our careers, and he's always been super insightful in anything that I've wanted to do. So that's number one. Second one is Fazana Rahman, who is the founder and CEO of Hexarad, which is a teleradiology platform with, AI tools. And I think, what I love about Fazana is that she's a super successful clinical entrepreneur and a peer as well. So she's just recently done her Series B. She's, scaled a health tech really successfully in the NHS as well. But the thing that I admire most about her is the way that she thinks through first principles. And she's built an incredible operational team, of which many of them are clinicians. And that's not the direction that we've gone in Patchwork. But I really admire how she's managed to leverage all these bright type A people and slot them in and develop them into professional commercial roles like operations, even in sales. So really admire the things she's done. And then finally, it's Lucy Zheng, the founder of, well, Charcot Neurotech and now Lions Neurotech. I've known her since we were students, and I always have this. I think for anyone who works with pixels, you kind of admire the people who work with hardware, and so I've been super impressed by what she's managed to achieve. Also, whilst founding her business with two small children as well, and doing it well at the time with her partner, it just goes to show that she spins so many plates, and it's amazing how she's managed to find that balance.
Awesome. So Fazana and Lucy have both been on the podcast as well.
Yes, I know.
Love
I
already.
did my research.
Yeah. And if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're in the workforce management space, come to patchwork.health. You can connect with me personally on LinkedIn, and of course, you can listen to me on my podcast, Out of Program. So find that on outofprogram.com.
Is there any way that the audience today could help you?
The audience can help me by, well, if you're a clinician listening to this, love to hear from you in terms of, and if you've done anything interesting in your own careers, come on the show. But nothing really. I live to serve.